welcome to myself, Max McGillivray from Beanstalk. Pleasure to have you today on our, Christine, I think it's our fifth outing of Women in Food and Farming. And we're going to have a great talk today with Christine and with the great Emily Norton, but we'll just go into a bit more detail with that. Before we start, Christine, can you say hello to everyone?
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much. It's absolutely brilliant that you all keep turning up. And I also want to thank the people who I asked for videos, that I asked them to do videos, and they all do them. And then everybody I've asked to speak says, yes, of course I will. And I just think you're all wonderful. So thank you very much.
Yeah, but Christine, that's because we're all frightened of you. And you just tell us that we've got to do this. Otherwise, it's going to be, no, we all love doing it. And especially in these odd times, to be able to bring such a cohesive group together and you not lose 5-6 months of momentum of everything that you set up, Claire Smith, more people have set up. So come on, let's give the big rah-rah to Women in Food and Farming, especially for those on the catch-up and on the podcast. So Women in Food and Farming is a group of professional women in food, agriculture and the land-based industries at all stages of their careers who get together to discuss business issues, support each other via mentorship and advice, and help generate networks of contacts that might be useful to themselves and their businesses. Founded in 2011 by Christine Tacon CBE, the group just started with 5 women and now has grown over to 500 members. And today, our guest speaker is going to be Emily Norton. Emily's Director and Head of Rural Research at Savills, and she'll be talking on the future of farming, making sense of Brexit, COVID, carbon and food. Very big subject. Christine, before we go live over to Emily, have you got anything that you would like to just talk to the group about, to update them on, please?
Really to say that, we're here really for everybody. And somebody asked me if we could sort of have a more serious topic and have a chat on Brexit. So we've organised that. And then somebody else said, could we please do something on work culture? And that's what we're going to do next month. And Beverly Dixon, who's the HR Director of Cheese, is going to be taking us through that. And we were just lining up some rather different people. We might even get a man on sorry, Max, not excluding you, but to do one of the videos. So, please throw suggestions at us for what you'd like us to cover and what you find interesting.
Fantastic. And Anne Packard, you're going to get the fly swap. Could you turn off your video, please, Anne? Thank you very much. She's going to look down at that left-hand side of the toolbar. And so just to reiterate, this is the 5th broadcast. Thank you, Anne. This is the 5th broadcast that we have done. All of the others are available on the podcast or on YouTube. And so we've had the great Sharon Kennett, the great Jane Craigie, the great Anna Harris, and the great Hilary Lees. And we promised that this one, Christine, we're not going to attempt to set a world record of the most numbers of pets with their owners or the pot plants. But that one was very successful, don't you think?
Well done. It was excellent. Well, you didn't tell anybody what you were going to do, so that was an even better surprise. So thank you.
Well, I thought you'd say, no, Max, we're not going to do that. This is meant to be a serious group. So come on, shall we get Emily in? Emily Norton, could you join us? So Christine, how do you know Emily? What's your background with Emily?
I've forgotten. Emily might be able to remind me how we met, but Emily has just I've had my eye on her ever since I first met her. I probably get some of this wrong, but as far as I remember, she's got a law degree from Cambridge, went back to the family dairy farm, turned that around, went into developed it into their own cheeses and yogurts and milks, which are all sold in my cousin's farm shop. And then she started working part-time for Stuart Agnew when he was an MEP, putting him right on issues agricultural with in the EU. And now she's found herself a role at Savills, and I gave my reference to them. And I took when they rang me up, I said, grab hold of her, because she's going to become a very valuable person in the future. So make the most of her while you can.
Well, Emily, there you go. I actually had this all written out, but Christine's already done your introduction. Was that the only thing that Christine was missing was the lunch on the 7th floor of the Savills headquarters, where you procured your role with Savills? Is that correct?
I know, absolutely. Yeah, that was your next opportunity finds you. You don't find your next opportunity, and that was a function of a very good kind of casual conversation over a buffet bar, where somebody said to me, Rupert Clark, head of estate management at Savills, said, "Oh, what do you do?" I said, "Oh, I'm a researcher." He says, "Oh, we're recruiting for a researcher. Would you like to apply?" And you know, that was it. But no, Christine has just done a completely over the top job of describing my journey through existence to get to where I am now. So that's all good. Actually, Christine, to be perfectly honest, I can't remember where we met either. But I'm very grateful for everything, all the guidance you've given me in my career so far. So yeah.
If I can just say something else, I'm glad I'm not wearing my Samantha Cameron dress.
I put it on today thinking of you, because last time we were in London, I was wearing this dress and we stood there wearing matching dresses. It was very embarrassing, like we'd coordinated or something, which we hadn't.
It's a lovely dress. It's very easy to wear.
Oh, that's hilarious. And can I just do one housekeeping point? Caroline Seaman, you're going to get my fly swat. Caroline, can you turn off your video, please? I love my fly swat. It's going to be. Thank you very much. It's working so well.
Are you about to swat me? Do you want me to go?
I'm going to ask you to go in a minute. I'm just going to give a little bit of an agenda. So Emily is going to start off for us on this subject. So just to repeat the subject that Emily is going to talk on. I've forgotten, Emily. What are you talking on?
Literally everything.
The future of farming. The future of farming, making sense of Brexit, COVID, carbon, and food. Very big subject, and Emily's going to speak for about 20-25 minutes. We've then got some of the group videos that some of the group founders have amassed. So the great Kirsty's going to roll those. We're then going to do a short Q&A with those people who did the video, with Christine and with Emily, and then we'll wrap up, say goodbye to everyone on LinkedIn, Facebook, and the podcast, and we'll go to the breakout rooms. So Christine, is that okay? Is that okay if we kick on the back, mate? So Christine, if you could move aside, that's fantastic. And Emily, over to you. Just let's repeat the subject one more time. The future of farming, making sense of Brexit, COVID, carbon, and food. Off you go.
I should have amended the front slide of this, which I didn't. Can I just say, Max, could you just let me know that that's actually sharing?
Yep, I can see it.
Amazing. All right, well, let's skip that. Okay, hello everybody, and it's a joy to be here. And Christine, thank you so much for the invitation to come and talk to you about some of the stuff that I've been thinking about and working on recently. So a lot of this has been informed by some of the policy work that I've done over the last 5 years, but in particular, my Nuffield travels between 2018 and last year, when I reported on my Nuffield as well about. So I was looking at agricultural policy design basically on a global level. So, you know, really interesting now to see how my learnings from Nuffield are being sort of implemented in a UK context, and doing my best to try and make sense of that as we go along. So the macro level pressures that are influencing on us here in the UK as landowners and occupiers and farmers, you know, fundamentally it's being driven by food. And if you ask, you know, any farmer in the UK, what do? They will tell you that they produce food. And my contention is actually that we need to get smarter at understanding that we're making money from the land and not purely making money from food. And I think if we broaden our purpose to that slightly wider setting of who we're providing services for, and that those services might be beyond food, we begin to open up our eyes to where some of these opportunities might be coming from. The amount of food that we're producing here in the United Kingdom is a really critical question, one that's been subject to debate, and we could all have a fantastic debate about what those percentage should be, what we should be producing, which bits are being unrepresented in terms of horticulture, which bits are overrepresented, and perhaps a function of policy rather than market influence. And it's, again, you know, I don't have a particular agenda on what that should be, but just so much as it's interesting to think about it. But really, when we think about UK land use, you know, some of these sort of slightly more valuable outcomes in terms of us being a small crowded island, and a lot of people own land for growing houses, you know, we can't get away from these influences on our farms and the places that we are privileged to enjoy. But big picture stuff going on in the background. School strike, climate strikes for schools, the Fridays for Justice type ideas. Biodiversity loss, though, is absolutely the critical one, and it's more urgent than the climate crisis, which is also urgent. But, you know, our relationship with biodiversity, and particularly the fact that we as society want to spend time in nature, and that nature is good for us. We are not necessarily good for nature, but nature is certainly good for us. And it's this very kind of nuanced, blended, multifunctional, changing landscape around us and around our simple industry of food production that I think is so interesting and so important as we look forward to get through the sort of pieces of legislation that are now being thrown at us as a result of Brexit. So I referred back to my Nuffield.
Excuse me, Emily, can you just speak a little bit slower, please?
Okay, Karen.
Thank you.
One of the key things from my Nuffield was the, sorry, just to say that was an introduction, and I will come back to all of those things as we go through the talk. So sorry if you didn't kind of get the full gist of the whole talk from that, but that just as an introduction. So to look at it in more detail now, the three major drivers on agricultural policy and on the shape of agricultural policy as we need it and should expect it to work at domestic level. And the first one is trade policy. And trade, as we all know, has been enormously controversial, particularly over the last 18 months as we dragged towards the Brexit agreement. But kind of the shape and the identity of UK from a trading perspective really is what, Liz Truss is grabbing by the horns at the moment. I heard on the grapevine that DEFRA don't even have the ability to kind of analyse all of these different trade deals in detail at the moment. There are so many of them on the go, and it's very difficult from that perspective to have offensive interests in those trade deals rather than simply to see them as being overall a bad thing. Now, some of you, it won't surprise to know that I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing. I think trade absolutely has a role to play in UK food identity. Fundamentally, London is a navigable city, and therefore we have been importing food into London since time immemorial. That is the entire foundation of the Commonwealth, was trade in food and goods. And so, moving beyond that, trading legacy is going to be, well, it's not impossible. And actually, you can see from what's happening now in relation to trade deals being negotiated that actually having a free trade nation identity is critically important to what the UK thinks of itself. Actually, in my opinion, having a very free trade policy is the single biggest and strongest argument for ongoing investment into our sector, because if we don't have a level playing field between our production standards and somebody else's production standards, it is de facto unfair, which creates this argument towards investment or subsidy in some sort on an ongoing basis. So I don't think we should necessarily fear these things. I do think we need to have a much calmer and more considered approach to how we react to trade and how trade serves the benefits of the many in this country, and where some of those ideas of equity might sit around it. As I just alluded to, food policy in a UK context has been entirely a corollary of trade policy until Henry Dimbleby came along and we had this whole Brexit thing. And so now we've got the National Food Strategy Part 1, which in theory government has already responded to, albeit on the QT. And we are likely to get a Part 2 to that imminently. But, what's interesting, Part 1 rushed out because of coronavirus, and obviously all of these purchasing trends that we were very aware of, very interesting in how they impacted on if you think sort of before coronavirus, we were all worried about trends towards veganism. Now we're all baking from home and using eggs and ice cream like they're going out of fashion. But these links between food and health are so critically important. And it's really interesting seeing Caroline Seaman on this call. Hi, Caroline, because I know there've been people campaigning on this kind of issue for donkey's years, and it's not being picked up. There's one health idea: what we're eating, we're making ourselves sick. So bringing these elements of policy together is a real innovation for us in this country. The other thing that Henry Dimbleby talked about was our need to define our status as a trading nation and how we reacted to trade deals. But coming in Part 2, which is just so interesting in my mind, it's food policy, a comprehensive vision for the future of farming, and a UK land strategy, and heaps more, including things around genetic modification and fake meats as well. It's unbelievably ambitious, and I'm so looking forward to seeing what he's finally managed to get into this report and whether it tackles some of these One Health big picture issues about the connectivity between health and between food production and food consumption. So sort of bringing all of that together, if they manage to do it, would be fantastic, might be the leverage. And actually coronavirus, as we can well tell, might well be the accelerant because of how it's revealed those massive problems caused by underlying poor health, and not just in terms of air quality, but in terms of what we are eating, and begin to invest in stopping people from getting sick as much as we invest in picking them up once they have got poorly. So the third element, we've done trade, we have done food. The third big element is environment policy. And actually you need to set those three big policies before you can even think about what needs to be invested into agriculture. Now, environmental policy in a UK context is taking two big threads at the moment. The first is climate policy. Obviously, we're all so aware of this. It's everywhere. It is, driving all sorts of different decisions and investment decisions. The Committee on Climate Change obviously have been hugely vocal behind the scenes, providing pathways from which industries that have got a carbon emission problem can transition to being net zero. In the case of land use, as we all know, it's particularly interesting because not only do we have a problem, we have a solution. And it's being able to provide that solution for the benefit of everybody else in society, which is going to make being in land use particularly interesting over the next 10 years in particular. As many of these drivers come through to 2030, not even looking at 2050, many businesses have set 2030 for their scope 1 and 2 emissions. So, on the right there, the transition will require concerted effort, actually by all, and any remaining emissions in 2050 must be offset. Very interesting to see early movers into the offsetting market, and we do a lot of talking about this at the moment. Early offsets may not be the best offsets. We've got to make sure that these offsets are priced properly so that they effectively work as an internal tax to ensure that really good decisions are being made in order to, rather than saying, oh, that's fine, we'll offset it because carbon is only £5 per tonne. If you put a price of £100 per tonne, how does that alter the internal decision making around decarbonising and the investment that's needed? I'm spending a lot of time working with corporates and institutional landowners in particular, thinking that kind of decision making through. The consequences of that environmental policy might be things like carbon emissions taxes and novel taxes on things that we don't tax at the moment, and also how governance structures work. So the TCFD is the piece of legislation, corporate governance legislation, which probably nobody has heard of, but I think is going to be massively influential because it's requiring all PLCs, large asset owners and financial institutions to disclose their climate risk. So that's meaning that the extent to which they own or invest in assets that have some sort of climate risk associated with them. So either they are carbon intensive or they're exposed to water risk or in the sense of floods or droughts. You have to start disclosing this. So it becomes something that shareholders and, sophisticated shareholders in particular can begin to make investment decisions on the back of. Now, if you are a bank and you are lending into the agricultural sector, you're beginning to have to disclose to what extent your lending into that sector is exposed to climate risk. So simply raising awareness through the finance ecosystem of some of the problems that climate change is going to cause, I think is going to cause a really big ripple down effect into the types of information that we're going to have to start disclosing to our investors or our owners or our landlords or whoever it might be, because they are being driven by these corporate governance disclosure mechanisms. So it'll be really interesting to see how that begins to ripple down in terms of what information we have to start giving when we sell a crop from the land. Scaling voluntary carbon markets remains a key question. Like I say, I'm nervous about this because I think offsets now are not legitimate offsets. We need to make sure that we're fully decarbonised before we offset. And actually seeing land, as we know, land is a multifunctional, brilliant asset. If you see it only through the lens of carbon, you produce some very perverse outcomes. The wrong tree in the wrong place is a bad thing, but carbon investors like trees because they're low risk. So how we work on scaling these voluntary markets is a key piece of research. Obviously, lots and lots of policy innovation going on in this space in the moment. But how we can begin to access that as a land-owning, land management sector, I think will be the key question that may or may not help in this transition away from the basic payment scheme. So macro level climate policy, micro level environment bill. Okay, the environment bill is back. It is currently passing through the House of Commons. Report stage has just gone. All sorts of stuff in there, which you're probably very familiar with. Long-term environmental targets in the 25-year environment plan. These environmental principles like the polluter pays, precautionary principle, and how they get implemented. They're not They're not enacted as standards within the Environment Bill. They're there to say that these principles should be brought into account in future decision making. So the extent to which all of the subsidiary legislation under the Agriculture Act has to comply with the polluter pays principle is a really interesting question in my mind. Massive reform of water and waste legislation, which has been very much sort of split between European competency and domestic competency. Elements around biodiversity, and again, how do we leverage the income out of the planning system in order to set land aside and deliver environmental improvement elsewhere? And then obviously the watchdog, who's going to be looking over all of this stuff, and how do we react and relate to them and our traditional, the Environment Agency, Natural England? How is it all going to fit together? There's so many questions here, and I think it's really important that we, be aware of where these trends are coming from. The involvement of planners and planning authorities in this stuff is particularly interesting around local nature recovery strategies. There's a concern it's going to be very piecemeal, and we're going to have under-resourced councils and a lot of difficulties in how we fit that stuff together and where decisions are being made within some of this stuff. Again, that's going to be particularly challenging for farmers, because you may end up being more answerable to your local county council than you are to the RPA. And it's a very big change of mindset for a sector which is used to just having one government paymaster. Fundamentally, though, and this is absolutely the point, right? The Agriculture Act, and I'll talk about that next, is the carrot. Okay, we've got the trade policy, the food policy, and the environment policy, which is the stick, or is the framework within which we operate, and actually all of those things should set the need for investment, the carrot, the financial piece coming into the sector. And I don't think we really think about it in that way enough. We're far too focused on the carrot under the Agriculture Act and way not enough on those bigger macro trends and the stick, which is in the Environment Bill. So, definitely one to watch. I just want to flag this to you because I only picked up on this yesterday. I think it's super interesting. So to the extent to which Neil Parish's amendment on trade standards, environmental standards in trade deals was like the controversial point within the Agriculture Act. It was the one that, 1 million people signed the NFU's petition to say that agricultural standards should be protected, environmental standards should be protected. They weren't successful. That clause wasn't passed. Chris Grayling has now put forward this new clause 19, NC 19, into the Environment Bill to require a labelling scheme for the environmental sustainability of food. I think it's super interesting. There's far too much text there. I'm so sorry. It was just a screen grab. But fundamentally, what it's asking for is an environmental kite mark on all food products that shows how environmentally sustainable they are. So looking at 4 A, B, C, and D there, the main categories. So protecting habitats, avoiding biodiversity loss, avoiding deforestation, and avoiding significant increases in net carbon emissions. If you begin to synthesize, and I'm not even going to go into the how. I know the how is incredibly complicated, but I don't want the how of this to detract from the why. And I think the why we need this information on food, on the point of packaging, is not just about consumer choice. It's not just about enabling consumers to make better choices at the point of purchase. It's about forcing supply chains to disclose this information, to be aware of the impact that they're having, and to start to talk about it. It's more like how TCFD is working for climate risk. This is about environmental risk at that point of purchase. And again, there are loads of pros and cons why consumer labeling doesn't work. But if we can focus on the push that's going to have on supply chains, I think it's really important. And I personally would like to see pressure put on this being fundamentally a good idea, because we do need something to change based on where we are at the moment. I put a photo of fake chicken on there just because I think within the agriculture sector and the food production sector, we like to forget that these tech investments are real. But actually, these motivations around environmental sustainability is receiving masses of investment from institutional investors all over the place, looking for climate smart solutions to global sustainability problems. And so, for heaps of reasons, whether it's efficiency in production from a strict financial sense, or whether it's to do with climate smart investment, there is a lot of money being targeted at this sector. And so it becoming mainstream is highly likely. Having this kind of environmental kite mark to show equivalence between these systems, it's going to be massively fought over. But I think it is so important that we are able to make a decision that says, are teriyaki chicken strips better for us than a chicken breast from the shop up the road. And if it doesn't do that job and create that bias towards truly sustainable, better health and better diets, then it's not going to do the job. My one plea is that we don't let the perfect get in the way of the good. This is not going to be a perfect solution. There's going to be holes in it. It won't be perfect. It's like the traffic light system for food health. But for all of the reasons around the global climate and biodiversity crisis, I just think that this is something that we really need to take seriously as a driver that consumers and investors and governments all want. It's sort of coalescing around this idea of doing things better. That's my personal view. So all of that stuff going on before we even get to the Agriculture Act, and that's really important to bear in mind. We've now got it as a piece of legislation. A lot of farmers are just focused on elms and the shape of elms and the budget behind elms. Those packages and how they fit together, a lot has been written about that. What we all know is that the money coming into the sector through direct payments is reducing dramatically over the next 7 years. So 5% for the smallest, up to 17% in year one for the biggest, 18% in year one for the biggest. What we don't know is what the value of elms is going to be long term. We sort of think it's a like-for-like swap, but it absolutely isn't. Elms is not a replacement for the basic payment scheme. It's also England only, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland developing completely different systems. It's really important that we budget and think for this differently. And that changes the entire makeup of how we think about our businesses and what we are growing and producing within them. Lump sum exit scheme, I will do this quite quickly. I just think this is so interesting because what DEFRA wants to achieve is a generational change in the occupation of land. We are predominantly old and we are predominantly male as a sector. So if the lump sum exit scheme is not the opportunity to get people into the sector to replace that, then I don't know what is. What I'm doing about that is just in the very early stages, and I'll say it, and therefore I will hold myself accountable for doing it, but it's to make sure that we are investing in really good new entrants to come into the system and effectively some sort of matchmaking service. We're also coaching people to be able to take on food farming, land-based businesses, whether it's timber or traditional farming as we might see it, or any of the land-based sectors, food-based sectors, to say you've great pools, great talent, great people out there who want to get into the sector who may not have the signposting or the skills to understand the structures around land occupation, and really to do something about that, I think is incumbent on all of us, but certainly something I want to do. There's a lot of people who are interested in this scheme though. So if by 2022, loads of people are exiting, we want to make sure that there's loads of good people ready to come in, and thinking about making those farm business tenancies smaller, more diverse, more vibrant, rather than simply getting them bigger in order to cover capital costs, I think is a really good way to think about it. And that's certainly the route that I'm taking with all of my bigger private and institutional clients in the day job. What do we know? I won't cover this in too much detail, but fundamentally the money that has been saved from the basic payment scheme, I say saved, the money that's not coming to us in income support under the basic payment scheme in the short term is going to be put into the farming investment fund. And that's why it's really important that we begin to think about our businesses and say, where do we need investment in order to be able to get through this phase? It might be in capital infrastructure, it might be in field infrastructure, it might be in added value on farm. There's heaps of different things that we might be able to think about, and it's also getting to that stage of perhaps a lot of the easy diversifications, the easy choices have been made. This might be the opportunity to think about some of those more difficult ones around restructuring businesses. I think it's really important that we kind of think that the last bullet point in my mind though is the most important one. Of all of that money coming into the system, fundamentally what we're doing is moving away from a system where government funds farmers to take the risk of planting the crop, the risk of producing the next generation of livestock, okay? We're moving away from that. We're not going to have that liquidity coming into the system anymore. So who is underwriting the risk, okay? Who's underwriting the risk in the crop? What if the crop fails? Whose responsibility is that? So part might be on your own business to diversify your income stream so you can afford to take the risk. But I think there's going to be a big focus on supply chain reform within the Agriculture Act. There are provisions within there. They don't really get talked about a lot at the moment within policy circles. But I think if they're done well, that will be the kind of thing that shows that actually it's up to supply chains to invest in the risk of producing food. And there needs to be a much more grown up approach between what supply chains are buying from farms and how farms are incentivized and rewarded to produce that food and take the risk in that food. Now, if you think back to what I was saying at the beginning about this kind of TCFD, climate disclosures, you see, I think that's why it's you can see organizations like Nestle going that we're going to commit to regenerative agriculture across all of our supply chains. So suddenly, yeah, they're taking responsibility for farm level actions and they're using the mechanism of regenerative agriculture to do so. Doing that fairly is part of that, but you can just see that these these reforms, these new ways of thinking within the accountability of supply chains is going to be really interesting and important. And no doubt Christine might eventually have a thought about how our current system of supply chain accountability and assurance might be reformed when we start having more of a top-down, we're coming for your data as well as your produce might impact on those systems. So that is very nearly the end of what I wanted to say. I'm very happy for you to challenge me on any and all of this. This is just my opinion. Real disruption is coming to UK agri-food production. The basic payment scheme, the underwriting of risk is going. Whose risk is it going to be if you decide to plant a crop next year? But real disruption is coming as well from those disclosure requirements, from those supply chain accountability requirements, but also from tech. The money being targeted at those innovations at the moment just means that somebody's going to find a solution that crosses into the mainstream. We're a small, crowded island, though, so there are always opportunities from people and property and the multifunctional nature of land use. I haven't even mentioned natural capital and all of those services that we can begin to provide to people, clean air, clean water, as they get monetized and as those opportunities become realized, which, all of the environmental signals are beginning to show. That signals real opportunity for UK farmers and land managers. We can excel at what we're good at. We can excel at the regenerative, the circular, the balanced production systems, and just accept that trade can balance the rest. Not every price point is going to be made happy. Not every consumer is going to be made happy. We can't be all things to all people, but we can be brilliant at what we do. I hope that is all in order and it made sense. And Karen, I didn't go too quickly through the second part of that. And I'm really looking forward to answering questions and discussing some of these topics with what I know is an incredibly informed and brilliant audience. Thank you.
Emily, thank you. That was a real powerhouse of a presentation. Kirsty, if you could get ready to play the video in about 30 seconds, and then we'll do some Q&As after the videos. I'm going to just very selfishly ask you one question, Emily, after that great conversation. Net zero emissions by 2050 does feel like the food sector, the agricultural sector, has been needlessly picked on. Whilst you were talking, I just remembered this quote that came out from the BBC that Bitcoin, so Bitcoin is a cryptocurrency, and there's people mining Bitcoin, and to mine Bitcoin you have to have server farms mining, don't ask me how it works, on an electronic basis Bitcoins, and Bitcoin itself consumes more electricity in a year than Argentina. So we've got this oddity of food and agriculture being told it's got to do something about its emissions. Then you've got these new startups that are creating all of this pollution, let's call it pollution, and the statement that there's got to be net zero emissions by 2050. Is it achievable that we can have net zero emissions by 2050? Do you think, Emily?
Well, this lies in the ultimate philosophical question, and heaps going on in that space at the moment. The specific issue of Bitcoin is fascinating. I mean, energy is only unsustainable if it's unsustainable, by which I mean you could be using renewable energy in order to mine those Bitcoin and everybody would be happy. So actually, replacing like for like on an energy consumption basis is absolutely fine. And equally, I do think that kind of looking over the fence and saying, that sector's got more of a problem than we do misses the point of self-responsibility, which is that if we're going to have a truly sustainable planet where everybody can live fairly within our planetary means, we all need to urgently do something. And so simply saying somebody else has got more of a problem is just kicking the can down the road. And we've got no more road to kick the can down.
Well done. And your last point on your summary statement about regenerative agriculture per se would look to be the solution, but yeah, we've got to drive that behavioural change to accommodate that, to create that solution. Emily, thank you. Let's bowl onto the videos, and we'll bring you back in. So the fantastic Kirsty is going to push the button on the video. So this is the views on the biggest challenges facing agriculture in the next 10 years, as per some of the founders of Women in Food and Farming. Thank you, Kirsty.
The biggest challenge facing farmers, given all the issues that need to be tackled, is embracing change. Change is hard and it costs money. And it's inevitable that many of the things they're going to be required to do will probably not cover the costs of actually doing them. And this is the same in practically every other industry. Moving with the times costs money and you just have to do it. And we can learn from these other industries. And the sorts of things that characterise them that maybe aren't the same in farming is the need for continual professional development, always training. And we are very lucky as an industry because so much is available, but doing things to broaden your mind, to get away from the day job and to learn from it. Secondly, is increasing diversity in business, embracing youth and gender and all sorts of other ways of thinking. That's important as well. And I think also taking the time to think and explore options. Because farmers need to plan for zero carbon, zero subsidies relating to production, and using the knowledge that they have and from previous generations, but with the technology of today. Thanks.
So what do I think is the biggest challenge that's going to face agriculture in the next 10 years? In a word, expertise. There is so much that is changing at the moment, and I think we're all chasing to keep up with those changes. I've got 3 points to make. The first, removal of subsidies. How are we going to make sure that our businesses are resilient enough to cope with the changes that are coming in the very near future? Second, I think a huge point globally for the whole of humankind, climate change, and more specifically carbon. Agriculture has got a huge part to play in this. How do we think we're going to be rewarded for what we can contribute towards this area? How are we going to manage our land and businesses with this in mind? Who are the experts? There aren't many at the moment. And the final point I was going to make is in terms of practical production, and I can comment on my specific area, which is crop production. We've seen a huge number of crop protection products revoked over the last few years. That's not changing. The tools that we've got in that particular toolbox are diminishing all the time. What we are seeing is R&D companies moving from crop protection solutions to seed trait technology. There's a huge investment there. But how do we integrate these new technologies into our crop production strategies? We need experts. Another thing that is definitely changing is the move towards artificial intelligence, computer technology. For example, how can we use an algorithm to determine disease forecasting in a specific area on a specific crop? It's fantastic stuff, but we need a human to be able to sniff test that technology and implement changes to strategy. We need some experts in that area. The final point in this part of the sector, I think, is nutrition. When we think about nitrogen and the carbon implications of nitrogen production and application, we are going to have to produce less from more. Again, need the experts. So that's our challenge, in my view, and what I am absolutely certain of is that this group contains those experts and future experts. Good job we're here, hey?
So my name's Debbie and I'm an agronomist by trade. So one of the challenges, the big challenges that I see in the next 10 years is the tool set that I was really used to using in terms of pesticides and fertilisers is changing very rapidly. And notably with pesticides, there are a number of key insecticides, for instance, that are not being re-registered for various reasons. So we're having to learn how to grow crops of grow good yields of high quality crops without some of the tools we've been used to, and having to use new tools like more IPM and biopesticides and things like that, all of which is really good stuff. It's just the sheer pace at which we're having to learn new techniques and embed them, and that against a landscape of having to feed more people, grow better quality crops, be very mindful about the carbon footprint of those crops, which tends to mean using things like less diesel, and be very mindful about the efficiency of water use. And there are lots of challenges of changing ways of working, which is great. I still think it's an amazing industry to work in with lots of opportunities.
The biggest challenge facing agriculture in the next 10 years is the climate emergency, and its impact will be twofold. Firstly, the changes to our climate we are too late to prevent, leading to more extreme weather such as droughts and flooding and species loss. Second will be changes to the way we farm and consumer demand as we try to mitigate the damage. Farming will need to go from a net polluter to sequesterer of carbon, which supports biodiversity, requiring a major rethink of accepted farming norms. And as consumers become more eco-conscious, we will see more people questioning where their food comes from and a desire for local, sustainable food and less meat consumption. There will also be more opportunities for farming outside of food as we look for natural alternatives to petrochemicals.
Again, it's fascinating to have that commentary from those four individuals, not know what Emily was actually going to speak about. Could we have Emily back in? Debbie, Camilla, if you're there, Christine and Laura, if you're there. We're slightly running out of time for the breakout room, so rather than probably doing a Q&A, what would be really interesting, we'll start with you, Christine, is your comments on the back of your video and the other ladies' videos in respect to what Emily was saying. Having seen Emily's presentation and the videos, have you changed your view, Christine, in any way as per your video?
No, but she spoke about things that I hadn't even heard of before. So I was really, really very grateful for it. But I think because my point was so generic, it is actually embracing change. And I think we're a sector that treats change, goes into change kicking and screaming and demanding government pay for this and government pay for that. And I just think that's when you start to get younger people, you get people with different thinking, people from different sectors into the industry. They don't come in with that mindset. And I think that's why it's so exciting. And I think why all of these ideas of saying, let's get new entrants, let's get new thinkers in is so important.
And Debbie, how much cryptocurrency have you been digging up, please, on your computer?
No, I'm long on spuds, not cryptocurrency.
What was your view? Having done your video and what Emily said, what was your view of Emily's talk, please?
Absolutely. It's about keeping up with pace of change, having trained, educated, outward-thinking people to drive. And that's so important, and we need to foster it and support it.
Well said. And Camilla, you were so on the money in the respect of what Emily was saying about the likes of regenerative agriculture and carbon sequestration. Is this just a fad? Is this just a fashion? Do you think that we're all going through, or is this here for the long term? What do you think, Camilla?
I think it will have to be for the long term. Otherwise, we're going to be in deep water, possibly literally. And
Emily, your thoughts from seeing the videos?
Well, there you go. Hive brain. There's clearly a lot of, zeitgeist out there. The interesting thing about regenerative agriculture is it's just mixed farming with a trendy name. And we've been doing mixed farming, especially here in Norfolk, since, Cook of Norfolk invented it sort of, 300 years ago. So it's not a new invention. It's just kind of a very old invention that we'd forgotten because chemistry got in the way. So, I think from that perspective, of course, it's going to stick around because it is, the best and only solution in terms of feeding people in an environmentally sustainable way.
But Emily, it's fascinating this terminology of regenerative agriculture. I was very privileged last week to do broadcasts in America and broadcasts with them, United Nations, and all of them were talking about regenerative agriculture. And it's interesting what you were saying, Emily, in your presentation about the likes of Nestle. If Nestle looked to drive forward regenerative agriculture, everyone has to adopt that to be paid by the likes of Nestle. We're going to drive that behavioural change, are we?
No, absolutely, and I think this is the interesting thing about what you are selling, what we are selling from our farm. You know, we like to think of ourselves as commodity producers here in this country. We are absolutely not commodity producers here in this country. We will only be successful if we think of ourselves as selling whatever produce it is from the farm with additional values. Whether it's carbon sequestered or water saved or biodiversity habitat restored, I think that, you know, once we get into that value of that mindset of added value with our produce, we begin to open up and have more interesting relationships with the kind of corporate level investors who are now being very motivated by those disclosure and governance requirements.
And Christine, do you think it takes some of the larger, most well-known, most respected trade groups, industry groups, I don't know, like Red Tractor, to try and foster this new revolution in farming?
I think it's got to come through pull. It's got to be coming, first of all, pull from consumers, pull from retailers, pull from supply chains. And that's all Red Tractor does, is it tries to reflect what the pull is and then has to balance it with the pull the other way, which is saying, I don't want to do it. I mean, for example, you know, Red Tractor was going to put doing carbon accounting as a standard. And we felt that, you know, if you're going to get to net zero, you've got to start counting. We weren't saying what it had to be. We just do an audit of your farm, understand your current position. And we had to walk away from it because there was just so much resistance.
Wow.
So we need the pull. Get the pull's got to be there.
Emily, come on. How do we get that pull?
Make it a condition of market access. Honestly, I think I was listening. I'm a massive fan of Clubhouse, Max. I don't know if you're on Clubhouse yet, but I was listening to a great conversation about sustainability and how we sort of transition the next 10 years of ecosystem restoration. And this incredibly learned, English author came on and said that I was having this conversation in the 60s. This is ridiculous. You know, we were predicting, I don't think that about, pop music in the 60s. It's, and Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, none of what we are dealing with now is novel. We've just failed to deal with it. And so sort of accepting that the current system of trying to solve it is going to work, I think is foolish, and accepting that we need major level policy change and regulatory change in order to turn the dial on the accepted level of externality and consequence for Western lifestyle is, it's a thing that's its time is very well overdue.
Okay, there we go. So we need that pull, as Christine says, and Emily has also confirmed. Everyone, just before we wrap up and go into the breakout rooms, just want to remind everyone that all of the previous 4 broadcasts available on the podcast. Also want to give a big shout out to Claire Smith over at More People. I think we're now up to 500 members with the group. I still think you've got the potential to be 1,000, 2,000, especially with the number of international people that are dialing in. So if you want to formally join up, all you need to do is look at, go into Google, Women in Food and Farming, More People, and you go over to Claire Smith's page and sign up there. So just before we wrap up, we're going to hand it over to Christine. Christine, any closing comments for this month's broadcast? And we've got no world records to go for today, thank God. But anything you'd like to wrap up with?
Only to say thank you to Emily. Brilliant as usual. But the next meeting is the 5th of April. We'll be talking about corporate culture with Beverly Dixon. And the other thing, pick up Max's point, the whole Women in Food and Farming started because everybody that came to a session went away and invited somebody else. So if everybody listening to this, whether live or later, invites somebody else to come along to the next session and to join Women in Food and Farming, because there are loads of people that just don't know about it. So maybe just set that as a mission, please.
Well done. Kirsty, could you turn off the live stream? Thank you very much, and we'll see you in the next broadcast, and we'll go into the breakout rooms.